Hello everybody, welcome back with another video. Today is on Soul Eater, the fourth specialized class from the Assassin tree. This is the scythe wielding class that I know a lot of Western players in particular were very excited for, and so I'm continuing my trend. I make every new class that comes out, regardless if I'm enthusiastic about it or not, just to learn about the class, theory craft a little bit, and then usually I'll settle on a build a couple of weeks after the class has come out and then stick with it. So today I'm teaching you guys about the Knight's Edge Soul Eater, which is the crit swift build of the class. It's the speedier build between the two. The other one focuses heavy on burst damage. This one is more about constant damage output. Quick overview about Knight's Edge Soul Eater. The best way that I can describe it is this is a mix between Deathblow Striker and Demonic Impulse Shadowhunter. Deathblow Striker being a class that builds bubbles and then expends them using skills. And for this class, that is the Soul Stones, these 3 crystals in her UI, and Demonic Impulse Shadowhunter being a class that is a lot more spammy. So you'll see that if I fill up the Deathlord meter down below, I will enter a state where it's very spammy. And this one is more about casting skills off cooldown and just kind of constantly attacking. As a preface, this class is a non-positional class. It is not possible to build her as entropy in either the spec or the crit swift build. Her skills do not have the positionals required to pull it off. That does not necessarily mean that she's a hitmaster class, though the spec build can run hitmaster. The crit swift build under no circumstance can run hitmaster because some of the skills do have positional, some of the skills do not. So the 2 playstyles that I mentioned, Deathblow Striker and Demonic Impulse Shadowhunter, those are the crux of how her gameplay actually is, and you'll be actively switching between the 2 throughout combat. And you have some control over this, but it's an automatic process. When you fill the Deathlord meter, you will automatically switch to that Demonic Impulse Shadowhunter gameplay until it empties itself out, and then you go back to the Deathblow Striker gameplay of filling up the bubbles and then doing bigger damage, spending skills until Deathlord meter fills out, and then you're back to constant damage, and you flip-flop between the 2. Engravings and stats as well. There's a few different stat distributions that have been done for the crit swift build. There's the heavy crit build, which I'm currently playing. I recently researched this one. This is the meta version of this build. You build full crit with swift as a secondary on your necklace. The other build is the 50-50 hybrid or 60-40 hybrid, which is around an even amount of crit and swiftness or slightly leaning into one or the other. And that one's usually played with the hallucination set. And then there is the extreme swiftness build, which is full swiftness, and then crit secondary is the polar opposite of this build. And that one is definitely the least popular of the variations, but some people have played it to good effect, and that one also uses the hallucination set. So you are effectively either using the nightmare or the hallucination set. Hallucination for covering missing crit if you go heavier into swiftness, and nightmare otherwise just for its raw damage component. Nightmare, you are not really playing the boundless MP state. You can fall into it, and there are some advantages to doing so, but typically speaking, you're usually going to be in the mana addiction phase while playing her. She can run into some mana related issues. However, this is solved by the Deathlord mode. If you play the build correctly, you should be regularly entering the Deathlord mode, which was that Demonic Impulse Shadowhunter playstyle. And in that mode, you have 300% mana regeneration rate. During that period, that's when you're refilling your mana so that you can resume attacking. As far as engravings go, these are the common engravings: Grudge, Keen Blunt Weapon, Cursed Stall. You have Raid Captain, which is either maintained by having higher swiftness or by a skill which will be giving you a constant stream of movement speed to help you reach RC efficiency. The class engraving as well as adrenaline. Many people use adrenaline at level 3 as she does not get a lot of natural crit chance from sources, and so she's heavily reliant on either pure stats set or engravings in order to get a meaningful amount of crit chance. So many people use Adrenaline 3. I'm using Adrenaline at level 1 because when I did her elixirs, I happened into the crit chance elixirs. So I am getting an extra 7% crit chance from here. A lot of people use the crit damage elixirs, especially if they're airing closer to higher crit chance rates. People who build 9/7 zones often build Adrenaline as the level 2 as well. So those are cases where you can get extra crit chance. Then obviously, of course, your bracelet as well can give you extra crit chance as well. This is just for planning because for many builds in Lost Ark in general, you have to be very mindful of your crit chance depending on what elixirs you're building. For example, if you're going to be running the crit damage elixir, which is 12% damage multiplier when scoring a critical hit, your class and build has to build for higher crit chance in general to have good efficiency with that elixir. So in my case, since the first elixir that I managed to build was the crit rate one, I just stuck with it and then I built around that, hence the Adrenaline one. Talking a little bit more about the Soulstone and the Deathlord mechanic. In her skill list, you're going to see that there's 3 colors of skills. We have the purple skills here, the turquoise skills here, and the pink skills here. These turquoise skills in the middle, they operate a little bit differently for Knight's Edge than they do for the spec build. For Knight's Edge, these are mainly skills that are auxiliary and for building meter while doing a little bit more damage or building heavy meter. They vary a lot depending on their usage. For example, the skill Asteros is commonly used in the 422 build, and this one does good damage, weak point, stagger, builds a pretty decent chunk of identity, whereas Soul Drain, which is pretty much taken by all builds of Knight's Edge, does almost no damage. On the other hand, it builds a huge amount of Soulstone meter. Your purple skills, these are your filler skills, but they become your DPS skills when you're in Deathlord mode because it deactivates the pink skills. And these skills don't do that much damage when you're outside of Deathlord. They're mainly there for building the Soulstone identity so that your pink skills here, your big spenders, can do a lot of damage. Pink skills, they get a very, very significant amount of damage when you are using your soul stones, but you need 3 soul stones in order to activate that, which is different than how it normally operates. Knight's Edge is what makes it consume 3 soul stones, and you get a huge amount of damage when you have those 3 soul stones to enhance the attack. You can see in the engraving here, you can't read it, but it's a 40% damage increase when you have 3 soul stones. It's pretty essential that you learn how much identity these skills actually generate, because the idea behind this build in general is you're trying not to use skills too unnecessarily in order to fill the 3 soul stones so that you can get your pink skills out enhanced without waste. An example of this is you can see that if I hit an enemy with soul drain, it's going to build almost 2 soul stones. So knowing that it builds almost 2, you just have to be very mindful that if you have 2 soul stones already, that you're going to be wasting a lot of the soul stone that soul drain can generate. The Deathlord mechanic greatly enhances purple skills. When this meter fills, they become your main damage skills, and they have really greatly reduced cooldown as well, so you can spam them a lot. And it's kind of meant to be a cooldown period. It causes some misunderstandings when it comes to the Knight's Edge build, which is, do you do more damage in or out of your identity? It's something that I've brought up before on my stream. You actually do typically more damage outside of your identity, and so the Deathlord mode can kind of be seen as a forced cooldown period where you're forced to use slightly weaker skills, you refill your mana as well. You're kind of also waiting out your cooldowns a little bit on your pink skills, since one of them is a charged based skill as well. That being said, it's not a huge difference between outside of identity and inside of identity, but in a real raid scenario, you're usually going to be having a higher damage contribution outside of your identity, especially because there are sometimes boss mechanics which will stall out your Deathlord meter, and so you won't be spending an even amount of time in and out of the Deathlord mode. The thing about the Deathlord meter in general is you can see here that it gradually decreases over time, and so if you are doing a regular rotation for Knight's Edge, You can see that after about 2 rotations of skills, you'll enter Deathlord mode. And then obviously that's when your spam, your pink skills are recovering their cooldowns as well. And by the time it ends, you're kind of good to go to start from the beginning. So she has a very rigid rotation, but where this can actually cause problems is in real raid scenarios. If the boss decides that they're going to do some sort of mechanic where they leave, your Deathlord meter may start draining. And by the time they come out of whatever mechanic they're doing, either it'll be completely depleted, which is kind of okay because, again, as you know, you do arguably more damage outside of your identity anyways, or you can end up in a very unusual situation where, let's say the meter is slightly filled up, you'll actually enter your Deathlord mode in a different spot of your rotation, if that makes sense. You'll be somewhere else in your rotation and then you'll enter it and then you'll have to adapt on the fly. You don't really have control over it since your meter is automatically depleting anyways and you can't exit the Deathlord mode early and all that kind of stuff. It can cause some odd situations, especially if you're running the 431 build, which kind of leads me into the next topic, which is build variations. There's 2 popular builds of Knight's Edge, which is 422 and 431. There's other builds as well, but I'm mainly only going to be covering 422 and 431 since I've played both of those and I can actually kind of explain them a little bit. If you don't know what these numbers mean, usually when people refer to 3 sets of numbers when they're talking about a build, they're talking about how much of each type of skill they're using. So 422, which was the old build that I played, used 4 purple skills, 2 turquoise skills, and 2 pink skills. The current build that I'm playing, 431, is 4 purple skills, 3 pink skills, and 1 turquoise skill. And this affects your rotation because of the amount of meter that these skills generate each between the purple and the turquoise skills. Remember, these are your meter generator skills and the pink ones are the spender skills. The 431 build is a bit interesting because it has a skill that you actually do not use with soulstones, despite the whole premise of this build being build soulstones, expend soulstones, build soulstones, expend soulstones. The thing is, these pink skills actually generate a little bit of Deathlord meter, even if you're not using soulstones, and the amount that they generate will vary quite a bit depending on if you're using the soulstones. So you can see if I drop this anchor here, it gets a little bit of soulstone meter, but if I have the 3 crystals and then I drop the anchor, it generates a lot. And you can actually see that the identity is not based off of hitting the target, it's on cast. And so what this means is we can actually use these skills independent of the fact of soulstones as damage skills as needed, which we use with the skills on E and R specifically. We use them to just build a little meter and do some damage as just regular cooldown skills. And these pink skills, they won't build any soulstone. They also will not consume any soulstone if you don't have 3. You can see in the rotation that I do, I use S, Q, A, and then I use my soul stones, and the soul stones will not naturally deplete over time, unlike the Deathlord meter, so you can actually hold this. Then I use W and then immediately E, and my E skill is not actually using any crystals when I do this. I'm just using it with W because they have matching cooldowns, so I kind of use them together as a pair. The R skill of Vestige is a charge skill, and no matter what build you do of Vestige, it's always going to be a charge skill because the tripod that gives the most damage also gives it a charge. And so when I'm at the Vestige part of the rotation, I'll use 1 Vestige without Soulstone and then 1 Vestige with Soulstone. It just kind of adds up fairly neatly to complete the Deathlord gauge when doing this. So even though the whole premise is to build Soulstone and use them up, you don't have to do it. There are times where you might be a little bit shy off from filling the Deathlord meter. Rather than waiting to build the Soulstones, you can actually just enter it by just using a pink skill without any identity. The 422 build is very rigid in its rotation, and it can run into some problems because of the stuff that I mentioned before with boss patterns, whereas the 422 build is a lot more freeform and only uses 2 pink skills, so it has an extra identity generator, which is either going to be Astros or Death Order, depending on if you want the utility or the damage. Death Order does a little bit more damage, while Astros gives you a bit more mobility, stagger, weak point. Just in general, the 422 build is a little bit weaker in terms of raw damage output compared to this build, the 431, but it has better mobility, it has a little bit of better stagger, and it has a little bit of better weak point as well. That being said, it's not really a big deal how much more it has of these. If anything, the mobility is the only one you can make a case for. The weak point, this build already has a ton of weak point, an absolute ton of weak point. There's one weak point on this skill here. Vestige, which has 2 stack, can be tripoded to deal 2 weak point each time, and so it can basically instantly dump out 4 weak point if you double cast this. The anchor also has a weak point as well and can also be tripoded for an extra weak point if you need. So at its max, this build can just really quickly dump out like 7 weak point really quickly. And if you don't need that weak point, then you can always tripod it for alternatives. In this case, if I don't need the weak point, I'm tripoding for things like mana and stagger instead, which has a bit more universal application in raid fights compared to weak point, which tends to be more specific towards specific fights that feature that mechanic as a whole. As far as the mobility goes, it's usually not too big of a problem, but you don't have a whole lot of mobility. Your A skill can be used for really quick mobility, but it's a really short-ranged skill. The F skill, if you have 420 skill points, can technically be tripoded at level 7 to gain a 6-meter dash, so you can get a little bit on that. And the F skill is also your counter as well. So this is the low skill point ability in your build. Most builds feature at least one skill that's pure utility that is low skill point. It's oftentimes the counter, sometimes it's meter generation. In her case, this skill is your counter, and it's also backup meter generation. Every build will feature it because every build has leftover skill points. You're not really using it for damage, but you can use it in Deathlord meter if you have like 2-3 seconds where you're waiting for a cooldown. It's just something you can throw out there. It has a really low cooldown as well. It comes back really fast. So it's a really reliable skill to have as a counter on the side for fights that feature really important counter mechanics. Usually Knight's Edge will have counter available. And outside of that, like I said, it's also a meter generation skill for the Soulstones. If something scuffs in your build, for example, you end up like missing part of an attack or missing an attack in general, using your counter skill as meter generation is usually a safe way of covering and making sure that your Soulstone is ready for the ping skills as it's coming off of cooldown. And because it comes off cooldown so fast, your counter skill, you don't have to worry about using it as emergency meter because generally speaking, it will come off of cooldown by the time you need it. That was 431, that was 422. I would say that 431 is more popular in Korea because it does more damage. It is a more raw damage build, having that extra pink skill in the kit. However, there are a lot of people that switched from 431 back to 422 despite it doing slightly less damage, because 422 is a lot more freeform with how you cast your abilities. You have more options for building meter, and so you're not really limited as much to a strict rotation. Compared to this 431 build, you're kind of able to just kind of cast skills as they're available. You kind of just quickly do the mental math real fast of how much soulstone each one of the abilities is generating, and then you cast accordingly. A lot of people really do like the 422 build for comfort related reasons. I recently switched to 431 for research related purposes, but I do find the rigid structure to actually be very comfortable, and in real raids it's kind of a baseline to work towards. But like I mentioned, the issues related to the uncontrollable Deathlord meter can cause some problems. Like I was in Thamine the other day, and one of the boss mechanics put me in such an odd predicament with my Deathlord meter that my rotation was kind of off kilter for the remainder of that gate, which felt difficult to recover from. But not all fights will feature that problem. Some are better than others when it comes to potentially screwing up the Deathlord meter. If you're playing 422 because you have so many options in general and you're not really strictly limited to a specific rotation, even if you run into those situations, you'll usually be okay. Chaos Dungeon for Soul Eater is pretty straightforward. She has a reasonable amount of AoE. Her anchor skill also resets cooldown when killing enemies with it, so you can usually spam it quite a lot. So she has a pretty comfortable Chaos Dungeon overall, and it's just either a Dominion or Betrayal angle, depending on if you're going to be doing or committing a swiftness build for Dominion. for just casting lots of skills off cooldown, or if you don't really want to bother and you're doing a heavy crit build and you don't have a lot of swiftness or your gems aren't very high, then it might be better to just use Betrayal. L mode, this class has just been performing pretty well across the board. We can also take this moment to kind of like talk about the class's balance in general. As you guys know, the spec build was recently nerfed a little bit. It was a very minute nerf, so it didn't affect her too much, and Knight's Edge didn't see any changes. And just in general, the class is probably the best balance that Smilegate has ever released. This is just based off of the past released classes either being undertuned, which probably about half the classes that have been released were released in an undertuned or mediocre state, or overtuned where the class released overpowered, which makes up quite a lot of the class releases such as Slayer, Sorceress, Reaper, even the early ones like Glavier, the Assassins, and even Paladin released in an OP state, whereas some classes like Scouter, Artist, Striker, and Gunslinger released in a more mediocre, not very overtuned state. So in the case of Soul Eater, she released in a state that was competitive but not OP when you compare it to the existing classes that occupy those high tiers of damage. So in terms of damage output, personally, I do think that the spec build is a bit stronger. The spec build, I won't delve into it since I don't play it, but I have done some research on it, and it really is just a better igniter sorceress. Her damage is better condensed, and she can take her counter with no problems. She has better mechanic contribution in general. You won't be disappointed if you play the spec build, especially if you're coming from something like Igniter Sorceress. You'll find a lot of things the Soul Eater actually does better, with the sole exception of just range of play. Sorceress is obviously a long range class with the exception of reverse gravity, but Soul Eater is more up in your face. And so Soul Eater spec build is kind of more true to the melee Igniter compared to something like Slayer. Knight's Edge, as far as balance goes, is actually very powerful. She is a high uptime class, so she's kind of similar to the likes of something like Pistolier or Aeromancer or AT Scouter or Sharpshooter, who kind of cover the gap between them and the high ceiling classes by just having excellent uptime. She's more powerful than my Pistolier and my Wind Fury Aeromancer, who are kind of lower ceiling but super high uptime. This build is also high uptime, but it features a higher ceiling, so there's really good potential for damage for her in realistic rating scenarios overall. Kind of in summary, this is a really good build. In my opinion, I found kind of low hit satisfaction from her. I kind of lean either towards classes that do lots of small numbers but they're cascading like a waterfall, and that's very satisfying to me, or heavy burst classes which just do these tremendous numbers once in a while, like BT Zerker's Awakening or Sorceress. Obviously I like those kinds of play styles. This one kind of feels more like Sharpshooter before they got the snipe update, when snipe was 3 separate hits, or sometimes even AT Scouter, where the numbers are medium numbers. They're not low numbers, but they're not high numbers, and they still kind of waterfall a little bit because it's very difficult for you to know how much damage you're actually doing. Maybe in the West for some of you guys that might not be the case because, you know, wink wink, La Biblioteca, but compared to other classes which can kind of just see it in the numbers as they're popping off from the boss, it's a little bit more difficult to notice how much damage you're doing with Knight's Edge. Very much unlike the spec build, which is very clear 9-digit numbers you're going to be getting with that build. This one is going to be loads of 8-digit numbers that will be very difficult to spot out from the waterfall of numbers as you're hitting them. So I definitely recommend it. A lot of people seem to be keen on the Scythe kind of class. Remember, if you're playing Knight's Edge, you do have choices with the set between Hallucination and Nightmare. I'm sure Salvation can work as well if you really want. Some people will ask if you can use MI. I'm sure you could get away with it, whatever works and whatever is available really. You'll probably notice the attack speed difference a little bit, but some people just deal with it anyways, just so they don't have to deal with the healing penalty from Cursed Doll or for that 2% of extra AP. Honestly, do whatever works and is most comfortable for you. The main decision that you'll have to make is if you want to play 4-3-1 or 4-2-2. Remember, 4-3-1 is more freeform. It's more about casting whatever makes sense at the time and then filling the soul stones, and that's just 2 pink skills in 4-2-2. Whereas 4-3-1, you do have a baseline rotation that you're always going to be trying to orient yourself back to, which can be comfortable for people that like having that reference point to always return to, but it can also be difficult because if your rotation kind of screws up, it can be difficult to find your way back, especially while figuring out where you are in your Deathlord meter at the time. Definitely a good class. She's strong, she's competitive, she's not broken OP, but you'll certainly see people showing off some pretty big numbers with her for sure. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Hope you guys enjoyed the class. The Path of the Soul Eater event that is coming out with this class does not have to be applied to this class. So if you're planning to Super Mokoko Express her, but you just want her as an alt and you want the support of the Path to Soul Eater on a different character, they can be applied as 2 separate things. I'm sure one of my contemporaries has released a video going over it more in depth. But yeah, that's it for this video. If you have any questions, feel free to swing by my stream sometimes when I'm playing her and ask about it.